I just want to thank all of you for coming. This is our first official colloquium of the semester, and I'm very happy that Suresh Naidu is able to introduce and moderate today's talk by Rishabh Kumar, and Suresh will give the background of both Suresh's academic career as well as his paper title. But I would like to introduce Suresh because this is the first time that he has come to the South Asia Institute, at least as far as I know. Suresh Naidu is Associate Professor of International and Public Affairs and Economics. He got his PhD in economics from the University of California in Berkeley, and his main areas of research and writing are the economic effects of political transitions, economic history of slavery and labor institutions, international migration, economic applications of natural language processing. And as you can see, he is the ideal person to introduce and moderate the discussion of Rishabh Kumar's presentation. So, Suresh, it's on to you.
Great. It's my first time introducing this, I'm an economist, so our norms are much more savage than the normal. We're like, oh, what introduction? I'm very happy to introduce Rishabh Kumar's paper, The Evolution and Metamorphosis of Indian Wealth. Rishabh is Assistant Professor of Economics at California State University San Bernadino, and previously worked as an economist for the New York City Department of Finance, and his PhD in economics at the illustrious New School University, and MA from the also illustrious Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a BA from Delhi University. Less illustrious. No. His teaching and research fields include political economy, economic and social history, macroeconomics, and inequality.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Like Suresh mentioned, I got my PhD. I spent a lot of my adult life in 100 blocks down in New York City. But the South Asia Institute especially has special importance. This was earlier directed by the late Ainsley Embry, I believe. His work was very important to understanding property relations in India for me, but much more importantly, he was also the mentor and teacher of my mother when she was a student here many decades ago. So New York baby for a long time. This talk is based on, it's about Indian wealth in the long run, but it's primarily based on this paper, The Evolution of Wealth Income Ratios in India. It covers 15 decades. And it also includes a couple more associated research results that I've been putting together. The ultimate idea is to put a collection of papers, about 4 to 5 papers, and get them published separately as a book for more general academic audiences, not just for economists. This book is basically about a lot of topics that have generated interest in recent years, but less is known about India. There's just not enough statistical evidence, and we haven't matched the economic history to the ongoing events in India right now. So this book and this research is basically about elites in the political sector, in the financial sector, how they transformed, how social elites transformed over 150 years in such a dynamic economy, about how wealth has changed over time and what parallels we can see between now and many years ago in the past. So recently, especially this year, there's been a lot more interest about inequality in India. Now, I'm talking about aggregate wealth in this talk, but there's been a lot of discussion about inequality in India. This image is from the cover of a new book called The Billionaire Raj by James Crabtree. Just came out a few months ago. Generated a lot of interest. It's, I believe, one of the top-selling books in the year. And there's a lot of interest in India and abroad about why we are in some kind of an age of extremes in this country. You know, it's an age where India is growing really fast. There's a lot of growth of national output, of GDP, a lot of urbanization, and yet and at the same time, perhaps because of these factors itself, we have a lot of extremes. So you have these, this image is generally cited as an image of extreme inequality in India. I don't see it that way, but the image is basically, this is the home of Mukesh Ambani, the wealthiest person in India. This it was a very controversial building, and this is generally cited to show that he's living in splendor, whereas the rest of the city is not. I don't exactly see it that way, and if you're a political economist, then you don't necessarily see those exact aspects, because what I really see is the city of Bombay, which is a commercial center. And of course, a lot of capital went and a lot of wealth went into building this structure, but you also have what's most obvious is it's a city of skyscrapers. There's limited land. Land is extremely expensive. That means whoever owns it or whoever has rights to that land has access to a lot of wealth, implied wealth, even if they don't necessarily use it to gain rents or anything like that. And it's not exactly an image of extremities. It's an image of the dynamics of a commercial economy. And a commercial economy is, India is right now a commercial economy, especially the city of Bombay, but India was also a very commercial economy in the last centuries or the last decades, especially of colonialism. The main impact of British rule is generally seen as an integration to global markets and a lot of sometimes enforced commercialization, but it was more or less a commercial economy. So the question is, how did we get to this state where now India produces some of the world's wealthiest people? What exact dynamics led to this? In economics, usually or in the study of capitalism, there tend to be two main forces that give wealth its importance. You build a lot of it, so you accumulate a lot of capital. That's the usual picture that we get from the ideas of Marx, that it just takes a capitalist to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate in the long run. That definitely creates a lot of wealth. Yeah, so if an economy accumulates a lot at the national level or at the private level, it's going to have a lot of wealth. But there's also a separate supply and demand for safe returns to existing wealth. So we usually, in economics, we think of it as a one good system where you can consume something or save it and accumulate it, and that becomes your wealth. But in fact, there's a demand for all kinds of assets that can generate great importance to wealth. And this is usually linked to the political circumstances or the exact environment in which wealth is existing. So if you have a deregulated system where there's a lot of opportunity for transactions and trading of assets, then you can possibly see these extremely dynamic effects in the long run. So today I want to speak about four different aspects of this. The first is the importance of wealth and how it's changed today versus comparing back to the past. The second most important point is that despite 150 years of economic change, the same forces persist, or the same forces drive wealth in the long run. Then I want to compare these results with what we know about the US, UK, and France. And this was kind of the topic of Thomas Piketty's famous book 4 years ago, Capital in the 21st Century. And the main message from his book was not so much about inequality. It was definitely about the forces that generate inequality, but it was really to do with how wealth acquires importance, why historically we've seen phases where wealth was not as important relative to the rest of the economy. And I just want to compare those dynamics and compare India's experience to what we've seen for the US, Britain, and France, and other advanced economies. Finally, I want to get to some implications. What does it imply if wealth becomes so important in a fast-growing economy today? What implications did it have back in the past? So we'll go from there. So the central result, two tweet summaries, so to say, is basically that obviously India has accumulated or acquired a lot more wealth than it used to. This is change over the 20th century. This is 1895. Wealth used to be worth about almost 400% of national income. So the aggregate value of wealth in India was worth 4 years of its national income. I'll come to some concepts in a minute. And by 2012, there's been a lot of increase in wealth, but not too much of metamorphosis. So it still looks more or less the same. There's a lot of land, there's a lot of capital now, but still quite a lot of importance of land values in national wealth. And definitely transition from colonialism, obviously foreign wealth, which was usually negative in India, has gone down a little bit, but doesn't play that significant role in the long run. Okay, so the source or the root to these studies is basically a collection of data sets. 3 data sets that I've built over the last 2 years. They have to do with the macroeconomic transformation of India. So I used historical studies, official accounts, and guidelines of the United Nations to build a set of balance sheets that could be extended back to 1860 using historical sources and methods, and using existing sources from official statistical bodies in India. So there's a huge macro database base that goes behind this. That's behind most of what's coming in this paper. But I've also been looking at inheritance records in India for the last 60 years and rich lists that are published by magazines such as Forbes or other investment banks, which rank the wealthiest people in India, where they get their wealth, what amount of wealth they have. So it kind of picks into the heart of the kind of stuff that Piketty talks about in his book. There are some differences because obviously India's experience is very different to the advanced capitalist nations of today. So I just want to introduce a couple of concepts. So previously people said, will non-economists understand this? Well, of course we have our own methods, and the historians differ from the political scientists. The international relations disagree with sometimes the guys in politics. The anthropologists think that they are better than the sociologists, and no one likes the economists. So at the end, there's some very basic concept that I just want to introduce before we proceed further. So national income is the sum of wages earned and returns to the capital or wealth of wealth holders. So that's usually how we think about national income. You earn a lot of income in the form either from your labor, you do a job and you get paid in wages, or you own capital and it gets you some returns in the long run. Wealth is the value of what is owned. So national income is referred to as a flow, and wealth is the value of what is owned at any given point of time. It's accumulated from the past. In the simplest sense, it's basically the sum of values of land, capital, and foreign wealth in any economy at any given point of time. So the ratio is what's called the wealth income ratio. So the ratio of national wealth to national income is what is called the wealth income ratio. Economic theory usually believes that in the long run, there's going to be balanced growth, which kind of is an important part of this talk too. There's going to be balanced growth. That is, the level of wealth relative to national income is going to stabilize. So wealth income ratios stabilize in the long run. And those dynamics are determined by a very simple relationship between savings, the rate at which an economy saves its national income, and the rate at which national income actually grows over time. So if you have an economy which saves a lot and has very little growth, then it's usually predicted that it's going to have a lot more wealth than compared to the size of its national income on an annual basis. So a simple example is if a country saves 20% of its national income and grows at its national income grows at 5%, it's going to end up with a 400% wealth income ratio. So wealth would be worth 4 years of national income in the long run. This is not something to do with inequality. This is the aggregate economy. This is the entire national economy, basically. But it does play an important role in the distribution of resources and in the changing dynamics of power within an economy. So this is how national wealth looks in the long run relative to national income. What you see is that there's basically quite close correspondence. These are on a logarithmic scale, so they kind of suppress some of the trends. But in the long run, you see that wealth has more or less followed India's national income. So the value of India's national wealth has been closely following national income. So economic growth and wealth have kind of gone along, except for this one unique period over here. And what does not appear in this subtle image is actually a growing disparity over here. So we have a period where there was a collapse of national income. That was the Great Depression, partly an external shock, partly the result of agricultural stagnation in India that started somewhere around 1905 and went all the way till the beginning of the Second World War. So this led to a collapse of national income. And this is a topic that's been explored a few times but never seen in the long run. This is the only major shock to domestic output that India has experienced in the last 150 years. And it created a strange dynamic, which I'll just come to, but as you see, wealth stopped rising in this period. Obviously, there wasn't enough income to create more and more wealth, but it did not collapse at the same rate as national income. So this is really the major shock that the Indian economy has experienced. By the time India recovered, you had famines in Bengal, you had the beginning of the independence movement, or actually the end of British rule and independence, and so on and so forth. And then you have economic growth comes back to a trend, goes on, and more or less follows the path of national income. National wealth and national income follow each other's path, but this stage, India is growing the fastest rate in the world, right? We know that India and China are the fastest growing economies, and their output is growing extremely fast. But what actually it looks very subtle here, or you wouldn't see it if you didn't compare these systematically, is that there's actually much faster growth of wealth. Wealth is accumulating at a faster rate than national income is growing. And coming back to this identity, it actually stands in the face of the standard economic assumptions that we usually make. We assume always that if an economy is heading towards a very high wealth income ratio, then it's either mature, like the US or UK or France, and economic growth has slowed down. These economies are now in a stage of demographic slowdowns. We assume that in such economies, okay, it makes sense that wealth from accumulated in the past is much more important today. Maybe you have 6, 7, 8 years of national wealth, of national income accumulated as wealth. But what's recently come to light is that we are seeing the exact same trends also in China, in Russia, and in India, which are not at the same stage of capitalist development as obviously the US or Europe, Western Europe. So what we're seeing is fast growth, so faster and faster production of output. The real economy is growing really fast. It's been growing at 6% since 1985, close to 6%. But wealth accumulation, and especially private wealth accumulation, has actually outdone that pace of economic growth. So it kind of disagrees with the basic so-called machine that Piketty builds in his book. His main idea was built around these dynamics of slow-growing economies, and that would lead to wealth becoming more and more important. And that's why the book was called Capital in the 21st Century, that the economies again coming to a slowdown, the advanced economies are coming to a slowdown, and so it's likely that wealth will acquire the same kind of importance it did until the late 1800s, when these societies were aristocratic or not exactly exhibiting any fast economic growth. So I hope I haven't discussed too many economic concepts. It's just a couple of important concepts. So what does this look like as the ratio? How does wealth compare to national income? You get this extremely striking fluctuation in the interwar years. So started out really slow in the 1860s. By the time the East India Company was replaced by the British administration, you have a wealth income ratio of about 250% in India. So not very wealthy, but not growing either. Output was not exactly growing at this point. India was a very stagnant agrarian poor society. There was some gradual increase, and then the collapse of domestic output basically pushes the value of wealth to become worth almost 7 years of national income. So this is right on the eve of the Second World War. Wealth was almost worth 700%. And in this series, I haven't actually included the value of gold and silver, which were actually pretty important in India, still are quite important in India, but if you include those, then this would probably shift up quite a bit. So the question is, what drove this exact rise? Why do we see this gradual and then turbulent rise of wealth in India in the interwar years? The collapse is basically related to all the chaotic dynamics that came with independence movement, but also with nationalization, with the implementation of policies, especially progressive taxation and limitations to investment. But at the base of it, it's actually just the resumption of economic growth. So by 1960, wealth collapsed back. So it's almost as if these 4 decades never actually happened. We're back to this almost the trend rate of growth. And then gradually, but quite strikingly, it's returning back to those peaks. Now these two periods are very difficult to compare from an economic growth perspective. This is a period when Indian economic growth is actually negative. It hasn't grown more than 1% in its history. This is a period where Indian economic growth, so national income, is actually growing at the fastest rates we've ever seen, 5%, 6%, 7%, and yet the faster economic growth the faster the economy grows, the more wealth is accumulating in the long run. So obviously this is going to play an important role in the way distribution comes to light in today's India, right? So if wealth becomes much more important, than those who have rights to that wealth are the people who are going to end up getting returns from that wealth. So it will definitely drive inequality, and I'll come to some small implications, but we still stick to the aggregate economy right now. Now compared to the advanced economies, how does India look, basically? So 1860, India's poor agrarian economy, and the US and France, the UK and France are obviously colonial empires, right? They've accumulated many years of wealth. They've gone through industrialization. A lot of their a lot of the value of their wealth is embedded in extremely productive agricultural land, but also in the transition from agrarian societies to industrial capital. So extremely wealthy, 700%, but not showing too much growth. And then you have this whole Piketty phenomenon, what Piketty refers to as the U-shaped evolution of the wealth-income ratio in the 20th century. So the Second World War, the First World War, Second World War, and progressive taxation kind of lead to this collapse of wealth in Europe and in the United States. And once that entire process is complete, wealth is rising once more. India, extremely different at this point, 1/3 of the amount of wealth relative to national income in India, but actually the positions are kind of reversed by the interwar period in terms of the size of the wealth income ratio. So at this point, or any of this point, I'm not saying that India is wealthier than the advanced capitalist nations, but the relationship between its wealth and income is what's given here. So importantly, at this point, India's GDP or its economic output, because of the size of its population, is actually pretty high. It's actually comparable to the top 3 or 4 economies. So if India has the same wealth income ratio at this point to any advanced economy, that's basically telling us that India is actually wealthy, or as wealthy, if not wealthier, than many of today's advanced economies. Now, obviously, there's a lot of poverty within India, but the value of wealth has taken on this immense importance, and it's one of the reasons why we see in this economy a lot of poverty, but also billionaires who are on top of the world's wealth rankings, and kind of the source of this billionaire Raj that James Crabtree is talking about right now. But the question is, why was wealth worth so little in 1860? So there was no growth of output, and the standard economic formula would have predicted that wealth, even with a little bit of savings, wealth would have been worth quite a bit. So you could imagine a society where basically there's no productivity, most of the people tilling land, living on subsistence wages, and you have a rentier society or a partially aristocratic society that's living off of this mass wealth that's been accumulated over the past few centuries. Well, the main point of the difference in these economies is that India had no history of investment or saving before this, or a significant history of investment or saving before this. Wealth has actually always played a much more important role in the past than we think of today. The Mughal Empire was basically organized around wealth, right? They collected works of art, they had a lot of gold, and the way they expanded their empires was through actual land expansion, conquest, right? So getting more and more land, getting the ability to tax more land, but not exactly investing in land. And the East India Company basically adopted those exact practices. So the first kind of taxation in India really is, in the last 300 years, is actually wealth taxation through the taxation of land revenue, with no incentives really for people who till the land to, or people who own that land to actually increase productivity. So it was a stagnant society. Starting in the 1860s, you have investment, public investment from the administration in the form of railways and improvement of agrarian yields in the long run. So basically a 40-year increase in agrarian yields. So social savings start to emerge in this period in India, and that basically starts to generate some amount of savings which can then be accumulated in the form of wealth, and that lead to this gradual increase in wealth till the interwar period. At this point, a lot of the dynamics are determined by the fact that national income slows down, but now there's enough wealth accumulated in the past, so the value of wealth begins to take on much more importance. Now, when you compare the entire long-run story, based on the saving story that I was telling you right now, well, India was an economy that was saving just a little bit till independence, and then pushes its saving rates up to the highest saving rates in the world. So in one sense, I could explain or compare this graph with what we see with savings, and basically what comes out is an economy with low savings at this point and much higher savings at this point. The question, I mean, this makes perfect sense, except for what we see in this period. So not enough savings, but like I said, and I showed the really high saving, the wealth income ratios in this period around here. So obviously the determining dynamics are not just how economies accumulate wealth in a simple sense. They save their national income, they acquire some wealth, they save some, they use it to produce a little bit more national income, they save some more, they keep acquiring wealth. Obviously, as much as savings have gone up, the Indian economic growth rate has also kind of gone up at the same pace and with no real differences. So what exactly explains the long run dynamics? What are the forces that are determining wealth accumulation in India in the long run? The simple way to look at it is to decompose wealth into three constituent elements. So at any given point in time, wealth is basically the wealth that was already in existence, new wealth that's been accumulated in the last few years, and any changes in the value of wealth, so the value of existing assets. You had all these assets such as land or capital, and if their value changes over time, then you can actually have an increase in wealth without no actual increase in productive capacity and no actual accumulation. And this is a phenomena that's kind of embedded in Piketty's story too, but it doesn't get as much attention. In fact, a lot of the dynamics of wealth in the 20th century in most economies are actually determined by the prices of assets and the conditions within which those prices could take on more importance. So if you decompose the wealth income ratio, so this dark line over here is just the wealth income ratio, but it's cut out into its constituent parts. What you actually see is there's not been too much of a difference in 100 years. So you have this period where there was a lot of wealth. This is the interwar period. What this is really reflecting is a collapse of India's output. It generated a lot of value for those who already owned wealth, but output collapsed. So you see this peak. But outside this peak, the value of initial wealth is more or less simply getting replaced by India's economic growth. So India is growing faster and faster, accumulating new investment, new capital, but all it's really doing is replacing old wealth at a faster rate. But if you compare this graph and you adjust for the fact that this is just national income collapse, there's almost no change, and all the dynamics in India are being determined by these prices. So this white gap in here is the value of just the revaluation of existing assets accumulated over 10 years. So literally the entire dynamics, if you think about it, and if you think about the political transformations in India over the 20th century, they played a pretty important role in changing these dynamics, and these dynamics played a predominant role in determining the amount of wealth and the patterns in wealth accumulation in India over the 20th century. So what you have is what's called a Ricardian scenario over here, where landlords who own land have the right to exclude those who don't own land, and so that gives their land a lot of value. You see this enormous price effect, and the independence movement, the partition of land, a lot of land into Pakistan and Bangladesh separates that land out. These were the countries these were the two areas actually in colonial India where productivity was actually the highest. So those ports are separated, that wealth is gone, basically from a political perspective. You have a lot of turbulence associated with the independence movement, but immediately when Nehru comes to power, he implements these commanding heights policies. That is, the state is the one that's going to do capital accumulation, not so much private capital. It was based on a distrust of capital, but also kind of a crowding out of whatever private wealth there was. So over this period, you have a price collapse, and that basically kind of eliminates all the so-called wealth accumulation that we observe over the interwar period. But the rest of the dynamics are basically essentially a phenomena of rising asset prices. So if you have assets that give you some significant advantage, you have access to land in a nice part of Mumbai or of a nice part of Delhi, then it's probably going to become more and more valuable, and that's going to increase your wealth in the long run. So the core forces have not changed significantly. All that's happened is India has transformed from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy to now a service economy, and with those new kinds of capital and new kinds of assets, you have a replacement of the older, longer living assets such as agricultural implements and tools with newer, faster growing and faster consuming industrial capital. But the dynamics are basically determined by how much importance asset prices have.
Just a clarification question. How do you disentangle the value of initial wealth from revaluation of existing wealth?
Well, we have data on wealth for each period. We have data on savings for on an annual basis for each period. So the wealth in the next period should basically be the sum of wealth that's been accumulated through savings, and then you have a residual capital gain effect. So you can basically back out those estimates if you have information on the flows of saving, on levels of national income, and the aggregate value of wealth, basically. So this is fairly standard in the literature. This is just how most people decompose it. But the lesson is fairly important. What it's telling us is there was a 20-year period where asset prices lost their importance, but they're back, basically. They're back again. And despite all the economic transformations, the basic process that's determining wealth accumulation hasn't changed in India. And this is why basically you have a lot of economic growth, a lot of productivity, a lot of people coming out of poverty, a lot of records broken in terms of the rates of economic growth, but asset prices are growing much faster. So those who have access to these assets can use these to produce output, of course, give it out as a loan or use it to build industrial capital and industrial output. But the dynamics are really being driven by the value of these assets. And because those dynamics are driven by those assets, this is how the composition of assets looks in the long run. So India starts off with capital almost just exceeding the value of land in the 1860s and the mid-19th century, and then this effect is entirely driven by land. I mean, in this period, India didn't acquire more land. India didn't go on a conquest mission and acquire Sri Lanka and Burma and Thailand or whatever. So it's the same amount of land, but its value increases relative to national income because land becomes more and more expensive. And with the separation of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and of course the resumption of economic growth and industrialization, which changes the terms of trade between industry and agriculture, you have a recollapse of land back. And then, so what's driving, in terms of the composition of wealth, what's driving India to become again a high wealth society? Well, of course, industrialization has generated a lot of capital. Capital is worth has the highest share of India's national wealth, but you can see a gradual increase again in the value of agricultural land. And what's really striking is we're comparing two completely opposite periods. We're comparing neoliberal India with really fast economic growth with the interwar years, which are the only economic shock, and yet we're seeing same exact patterns in both these.
Sorry, clarification. Is that urban and agricultural land?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not
all
just
yeah, it's not just agricultural land. Yeah, this is basically driven by, so you have a decline in agriculture, and urban land takes on a lot more importance at this point. So now, in the interwar period, this generated quite a bit of chaos and a lot of redistribution. So using distributed national accounts, the first thing you see is the power of rents, that is the ability of landlords to generate more and more rents out of their property actually started to increase a little bit. And at the same period, you also see the peak of Indian income inequality. So the top 1% share, measured using tax data, actually peaks at this period and collapses immediately after the independence period. So when comparing these two periods, we're comparing fast-growing India, which is supposed to be market-driven, with a stagnant phase, which generates these kinds of social redistribution. And in the past, we've seen that this produced kind of staggering inequality. So the top 1% in this period basically acquired 20% of the entire national income. So pretty unequal phase in terms of the distribution of economic power, and you see a rise of property income. So these different data sets kind of confirm what we know about India in the interwar period, and what we learn about what happens to an economy when it goes through these kinds of dynamics. So it's a temporary patrimonial society. It's the kind of society that we see in 1700 and 1800 Europe in terms of the class distribution and acquisition of wealth. So yeah. Now what happens with the transition? And this is kind of extended ongoing research. What happens to an economy which has the potential to generate these patrimonial societies when it goes through 3 decades semi-socialist experience? You know, it goes through this Nehruvian era with a lot of progressive taxation, and the political class realizes that wealth was actually pretty important. So if you see the speeches of Nehru and subsequently Indira Gandhi, then they actually were aware of the fact that wealth was actually, private wealth especially, was playing an important role, and the fact that it was predominantly rooted in land at this point is one of the reasons why there were a lot of land reforms. That is, cut those pieces of property and give it out to the rest of the economy. But in the process, what they actually ended up doing is transforming India from predominantly royal wealth holding society to industrial capital. So this is 2016. These are the 10 richest people in India in 2016, and these are the richest 20 wealth taxpayers in India between 1960 and 1975. These are basically the wealthiest people in India, and these were almost all of them, barring one or two, and a pension fund, all of them were royals. So these were the people who had access to these kinds of resources that would have generated this kind of wealth. I don't know if this is very visible, but it's on my website. You can get access to it. So most of the well-known families of the colonial era, most of the princely class of the colonial era, were all basically taxed out. They faced 150% wealth taxation in some cases, a lot of inheritance taxation, and one of the most underrated or unappreciated legal experiences in the Indian Constitution, which is the Indian Privy Purse Act, which was implemented in 1971. It's actually a really important moment in the transformation of wealth in India. You have a long period where Indian wealth was basically partly nationalized, but you still allowed the aristocratic class to kind of have a tax-free existence. So they don't hold the same amounts of land that they used to. India has taken some of it in the 1950s, but you have this period where they don't pay taxes. For their role in the unification process of India, they're given these privy purses. The state is going to pay them some money instead of taxing them, and they're allowed to live as rentiers. You have access to your bungalows and your estates and some of the land, and the rest of the Indian economy is going to accumulate capital using public investment. So they basically get a free ride till 1970. Indira Gandhi then pushes through this act, kind of overriding the Indian Constitution and its protection of private property rights, and basically starts identifying each of these characters and kind of reducing the amount of wealth they had. They weren't very wealthy because the price of their assets weren't as important as they used to be, but basically she's able to eliminate a lot of them over a 10-year extreme wealth tax repression process. So what happens? These guys, their wealth gets taken by the state, and by the time the state decides to let go of its planned industrialization phenomena or process in the 1980s, you have the emergence of the Indian capitalist class. Of course, they were important in the British era too, but today they are comparable to the world's wealthiest people. So all of these people who were more or less in 1986, when these policies kind of stopped, were basically young and between 35 years old. Some of them had inherited empires, but most of them build their wealth over this period. They basically start to acquire a lot of important assets in this period, and they are the ones who've benefited the most from India's industrialization process. So the goal here is to just link the changing wealth income ratio to what was happening at a social composition level. So what was India at independence? It was a predominantly poor economy. It had a royal class that had political influence, not too much in terms of wealth. They didn't have the power to act as royals, but they had some amount of wealth. A country that was planning to industrialize and wanted to reduce these inequities through its planned process had no choice to allow this kind of existence to continue. They taxed them out, and by the time the state embarks on deregulation and market-driven economic growth, you have these young characters coming into play and kind of dominating Indian wealth since then. So just to compare how much wealth has changed in the independent era, so I showed you guys the graph of interwar India and how that generated some inequality. Well, in 1967, the richest 0.01%, wealthiest 0.01%, had wealth which was worth about 7 or 8% of national income. So national income is different from wealth, but this is just telling you how many months worth of national income they could finance based on their own wealth. So if they were by any chance to just pay wages based on that, they could finance a couple of months of India's national income. By 2017, the richest 200 individuals, so much smaller fraction than the 0.01%, has wealth which is worth about 25% of national income. We don't have extremely good data on wealth distribution in India, so there's no way to compare wealth shares in the long run. But obviously you can see the transformation and the re-importance of wealth between the Nehruvian era and the modern era. And this trend basically also corresponds to the change in income inequality over 100 years in India. So this is the same interwar period that I showed before. This is data from Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chancel. You can see that there's a rise in in the concentration of economic resources measured by income in this case over the same exact period. So at the time when wealth acquires all this importance, something else is going on. Obviously, there's obviously excellent conditions for people to be wealthy and for the elite to acquire as much of national income as possible. They go through this huge downfall, and starting with in the 1990s, with India's new emerging economies, these inequalities are rising. Now, besides these inequalities, what's the fundamental challenge that India faces in terms of wealth in the 21st century? So this takes everything from the past. One of the constraints that we see for India is that it's growing fast. So this is the population in India, and these other countries, so the US, France, UK, Japan, China, and India. And this is the total land per person in each of these countries. And each of these countries, so these countries, the Western advanced capitalist countries, are all going through a phase of demographic slowdown. So they are not able to actually get too much population growth except for the United States through immigration. But each of these economies has a lot less pressure than India does in terms of what can happen in the future, because India has a lot less land per person, especially urban land per person, compared to each of these economies, and its population is only going to go further to this direction. India's population is growing much, much faster. So the direction of this graph basically for India would be somewhere in the direction southeast. Land becoming more and more scarce, so whoever owns the rights to land becoming more and more wealthy, because there's much more demographic pressure on land in India that we see in these countries. And what's remarkable is that even in these countries, the return of wealth to their high levels is actually driven by real estate prices. So if that problem exists in those countries, it's likely to be a lot more aggravated in a country like India. So, just to conclude, what this research has shown is that India's wealth is returning to past peaks, even if those peaks were temporary. There is being reproduced by a sustained and more structural rise of wealth-income ratios. The fact that it's happening in a period of economic growth means this happens in kind of a different way than Piketty imagines for the advanced capitalist economies, and these trends are fairly close to what we see for colonial India. So what is the actual dynamic? So in economics, we always tend to think of the evolution of wealth as some kind of balanced process. It's going to increase in certain periods, but over time, the fundamental structural factors that determine it are how much a country saves and how fast it can grow. So we always think of a balanced outcome. In the long run, wealth is going to stabilize at some level because growth is going to slow down, and then savings are not going to increase anymore. And this is kind of at the foundation of economic growth theory, basically. Experience kind of suggests that it's unlikely that we see this outcome, because in economies at all kinds of different stages of capitalist development, whether it's advanced or recently coming out of communism or going through their first development phase like India, we're seeing that wealth income ratios are rising on a global scale. So it's actually, I mean, there's a lot to learn from the Indian experience in terms of what we know in general about economic growth. Can economic growth ultimately give us balanced growth in the long run, or balanced wealth income ratios in the long run? It seems difficult because not only are we seeing this phenomena in slow growth economies, but in fast growth economies too. So any stage of your development process, there's a tendency to see these kinds of effects. These ideas were more closely linked to what David Ricardo and Karl Marx had in their literatures in the 1800s. They were talking about a scenario where eventually either capital or wealth could actually overshadow the productive part of the economy due to class relations and class conflict. Okay, so last point before I conclude is that the main force that drives in India, and it seems in other countries that seems to drive wealth and wealth accumulation, is not so much these technical aspects, but actually it's the expectations of future benefits to what asset owners expect. So if the political and economic circumstances are ideal for you to own wealth and in the future expect much more wealth or returns out of your wealth, then there is no reason why the technically determined economic growth model necessarily will teach us anything new. In fact, these seem to be the kinds of forces that that show us these parallels between today's economy and the colonial economy. Commercial economies with adequate space and deregulation for capital to move freely. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. That I learned a lot from that. So I'm going to start off with sort of two sort of broad comments, I guess. One thought is actually kind of, and I hope this comes out more in the book, is kind of just what these kind of quantitative results actually push us in thinking about what wealth is, in the sense of, so let me make it concrete. So in Piketty, one of the criticisms Piketty often gets is that he's not including the value of human capital or labor in the definition of wealth. It's purely financial and physical wealth. And he says, well, because you can't put, in a non-slave society, you can't put human labor out as collateral. There's not an open market for it. It doesn't make sense to value labor the same way you value capital. And so that's and so that's why he says so when there is a slave economy, you include slave wealth in the measure of wealth, but then when slavery is abolished, you take it out. And what's interesting about that is that it gives you sort of like an institutional boundary around which, okay, what things you put inside wealth depends on what things are up for sale. And so one of the questions I sort of have is thinking about kind of the penetration of capitalist property relations in the 19th century, kind of giving us not necessarily that all of India is integrated into the market. And so the valuations of the titles of land are kind of spotty. It's not clear what's up for sale. It's not clear that they're assessed at kind of anything close to what like a market for those properties would be. And I'm particularly thinking of when we sort of start assessing the properties of zamindari, how do we start doing that? Do we take the discounted tax flows coming into the zamindar and discount them back by some discount rate? Or is that sort of the right way to do it? Or was there in fact like somebody making offers to British were trying to buy out some zamindaris, so are we getting the prices from that kind of like very sparse market? So and broadly the point is that when you have kind of these only partially capitalist relationships, what it means to defend the wealth, the value of something, really depends on kind of like the extent to which kind of tangency between that asset and the market you want to take. And like where are the income flows coming from? How is it being assessed by kind of all kinds of other actors? And that's actually really interesting because it means that it brings a big role for kind of all of the sort of literature on post-colonial and colonial property relations to like make an appearance and show up in, you can imagine a table that's like under this definition of wealth, here's what 19th century wealth would have been, but under this other definition of wealth, here's a different number for what 19th century wealth would have been. And that would be pretty interesting in telling you how the institutions like contingent make the valuations contingent, and then you can kind of reach into this. So I think you tell a lot of great history about the macro structural stuff at like kind of the national level. But what I kind of wanted was more like micro historical stuff. Like here's where a landlord of the 19th century makes their money, and here's how much that's coming from like the shares that their tenants are paying, and that kind of sort of making the wealth show up as like a concrete flow from the real economy to an asset holder. My second comment is a reactionary one, in the sense that I actually think your results speak much more to like they're way even more neoclassical than classical, or even sort of, let's say they're new classical rather than neoclassical or classical, in the sense that they're pointing out that savings rates are endogenous. And so any kind of like optimal kind of growth model will tell you when the economy experiences like kind of a productivity kick from say deregulation, what you should see happening is capitalists will raise their savings rate because the returns to investment have increased as part of that productivity shock. And so the increase in savings that's coming along with the growth rate is actually a pushback against kind of Piketty and Solow and Keynes even, that are kind of have this idea that there's like an institutionally fixed savings rate. and then that gets divided by some G parameter, and so as G gets up, as G increases, that should kill wealth. But a more like neoclassical model will tell you, no, capitalists are in fact forward-looking and trying to invest, and so when the economy sort of experiences a productivity growth shock from like liberalization or whatever, that capitalists should start saving more. And so I was curious about why you kind of, or like, taking that kind of on board and dealing with and ruling that out. And the last thing that I thought was just kind of interesting was, and underplayed in the draft that I sort of thought was just how interesting the 100-year series on net foreign assets is, given how much of so just to put this in some context, so much of the historical literature on Indian wealth was about documenting the outflow of wealth to the British Empire. And it was basically armies of Indian historians worked on sort of like trying to measure how much was on the outflow. And now what we kind of have is this sort of comprehensive view of the net, and that's measured by the net foreign asset position, which in the graph that Rishabh showed was like negative throughout the period, and then becomes positive in just that 5-year blip after independence, then goes back to being negative all the way through. And so that's like really interesting that, for all of the furor around, getting India out of being a net emitter of income abroad, even after independence, it's just for a very short moment that India is in fact like a net foreign asset holder instead of a net foreign creditor. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and I hope that sort of again comes out in kind of the book.
Okay, so should I respond to this? Yeah. So I think the first suggestion is actually pretty good. The value of land is actually assessed through sales transactions and weighted using revenue records, tax revenue records, and most of this comes from calculations by Raymond Goldsmith for the 1800s. For the 1900s onwards, we have much more sales transaction information, and that's what we use to build a series. You're right. I mean, definitely the meaning there is an embedded meaning to what wealth means in a semi-capitalist, partially colonial, completely colonial, partially commercial economy versus a democratic society where you have a lot of economic growth and different kinds of pressures on assets like this. But definitely, that's something to that's something I should definitely include and talk about. But in terms of data, it's 3 unified sources of transaction records. Are they the best indication of what land was worth? Probably not the best, but yeah, so far one of the few that we have on hand for those transactions. I do try to supplement that with information micro studies in the actual draft. How exactly land is acquiring this value up. So was there a period where there were a lot of transactions because land was becoming productive for a small period? And we do see that, yes, in using a micro study of Punjab, for example, the Punjab region, see that transactions kind of blew up in the early 1900s, and you have all these former peasants trying to acquire land, and then you have a collapse of they take mortgages, they buy a lot of land, but you have a collapse of the economy, and then they're forced to kind of make up these rent payments using by selling off gold or selling off their land to larger landlords or the zamindars in that period. Regarding the second point, this is there's only one neoclassical growth paper that actually addresses something like land. There's a lot in asset valuation, and I know that there's so much of the neoclassical literature that looks at asset valuation and the endogeneity of these things, but there's only one real paper that talks about land in the long run in a growing economy that puts it in a balanced growth framework. It's in the AER in 1970 by David Nichols. It's very hard to put one concrete story that can explain necessarily whether it's endogenizing saving. This is a technical part of the economist. But you're right that it doesn't necessarily play to the strength of the Marxist interpretation for sure. And I think I see it more as a Ricardian story, but one in the face of increasing growth, which is endogenous to a population in some sense. So I think the accounting story and the historical story is kind of the framework, and you're right that there is some scope to actually investigate this, not in a Marxist perspective, but from the perspective of a new classical model, and definitely something I'll look into. Regarding the net foreign asset position, yes, it doesn't receive that much attention in the paper, but it's a very contentious issue. I mean, India's net foreign asset position has generated nationalist, anti-nationalist literature for, of course, 150 years, and it's likely that this battle between historians is going to go on for another 150 years. There's a lot of work by Angus Madison that shows that the thorn in the nationalist literature is basically this drain of wealth concept that Dadabhai Naoroji promoted in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The idea was that the British were draining the productive capacity of India rather than, not wealth the way we understand it today, but the productive capacity. And the foreign asset position actually stays constant. Angus Madison shows that, in fact, the actual extraction out of Indian savings was not as high as Dadabhai Naoroji or other nationalist writers were estimating at that point in time. So, I mean, there's contention over whether that effect was overplayed. Of course, there were consequences of being in a colonial society where you're imposed into this global commercial architecture, but a lot of the literature now, a lot of the new literature in Indian economic history believes that role was overplayed. It was more of what was going on in terms of the external shocks to the Indian economy. And I mean, it's very difficult in today's day and age to argue about the drain of wealth when you have someone like Tirthankar Roy at the LSE. The first thing he does whenever he sees any argument about drain of wealth is he pushes 10 tables in front of you from Angus Madison and he says, this is impossible, there's no way for there to be so much of a drain of wealth. So why does India's foreign asset position turn positive temporarily? Well, the British needed to finance the war and they needed capital from India at that point. It's the only reason why it turns positive. Immediately after independence, the state needs to generate capital. It has no income to generate it because people are poor, basically, and there's no savings to generate those kind of finances. It starts going to the foreign market, does a lot of borrowing, takes on a lot of public debt. What's striking is actually that the foreign asset position is slowly, it's very subtle, but it's slowly declining. And what we see is that public debt slowly, as India becomes wealthier in terms of, richer in terms of its income, as most of the public debt, which used to be foreign debt, is now internal debt. And you have the rise of these capitalists that are making claims on public assets through all kinds of financial transactions and financial asset sellers.
I think there was something.
Basically a data question, which is influenced by my own field experience in working on land consolidation in UP, which I can put, first of all, how do we know what the ratio is of reported and unreported things, black money issues? But more importantly, it seems to me that if you rely on land revenue disappears as a data point in peace. And in addition, in land consolidation, the whole of UP and the whole of Punjab and Haryana, land consolidation increases the value of land by putting it together.
Yes.
And it doesn't show up in any, as far as I can tell, in any data source that you could think of. It's not in land revenue that you find this out. It's only by talking to farmers that you find it out. And it's a serious, and the farmers that I talked to estimated, and that seems to be general, that it doubled their income, just simply rearranging the land.
In which period?
This is in the 50s and 60s,
I see.
And 70s and 80s. I mean, in this period. In Punjab it was earlier, but Malcolm Darling estimates in 1948, that's what farmers were telling him is a general thing. So that's two halves of the data question. In the current period, where on earth do you get figures of wealth that people intend to hide?
So, reported, unreported wealth is an ongoing challenge, and definitely these figures should be taken as a kind of baseline benchmark level of wealth. It might just be a little bit higher. But with land, there's something particularly interesting, which is that the government realized that there's no way to assess land using tax records, because it's one of the main vehicles for how India actually transmits wealth across generations. You buy urban land, you know that you can undervalue it in the actual transaction, and no one and the tax authority doesn't come to know. So what the surveys now do is, I mean, this is true for the last 15 years, is they actually ask people the property size, I mean the size of their land, and they don't assess it based on what they tell them. So they go to the local registrar and they ask them what this plot of land would cost in this part of this district, and using those registrar records you actually get the values of land today. And I mean, I use the same source, the surveys from the 1950s to today. They're the only source we have for an aggregate value of land. So they definitely come, so there, as much as there is underreporting, it's kind of mitigated by the way the surveyors design their reports. But of course, there's a lot of benami transactions, as they're called, these hidden transactions, on which there's just no way to put numbers right now. It's been, I mean, I've been trying to do it for the last 2 years, consulting with tax authorities on how to exactly do it. It's just an extremely expensive challenge right now. But I mean, who knows, if this method continues, we might actually get more and more. I mean, if people have to report their Aadhaar cards and PAN cards, just how much property they own in India, at some point, maybe 10 years from now, we might have a better assessment. But I think the story about consolidation is really interesting. So there's a Japanese economist, economic historian, S. Hiroshima, who's collected these micro studies of Punjab, both before and after independence. He focused a lot more on Pakistan, which was more fertile for the independence before, in the colonial time. But he does these micro studies and he finds this consolidation too, but it's actually driven by this redistributive process. So you have these peasants who had acquired land, I mean, who had taken on mortgages to get access to land. And what happens is, once the economy collapses, they have no way of paying back their rent, so they start selling these pieces of land to the bigger landlord in the area, who gets a larger piece of land, and then he or she is being pressured to sell that land to another landlord, and he's hiking up the prices, and that's what is kind of driving those prices in that period. So yes, I know that those effects happen even after independence, but the exact dynamics are unclear. I mean, that's something to go into, but we'll just extend this line of research to a lot of microservices, but definitely something that I should actually look into in terms of these field surveys. Thank you.
On the story of that, what's happening with net foreign assets. The net foreign assets in the colonial period, the mid-19th century, whose debt were they? Because we know the story, I mean, after 47, there's a lot of public sector borrowing and a lot of foreign borrowing of all kind. We have records of that and we have good data. But what is the kind of, who are the debtors in India?
Well, I mean, it's established enterprise in India. Railways, basically, a lot of it is floating of debt in London to finance the railways. Most of the debt comes in the form of railways. A lot of debt is also borrowing to increase productivity in some parts of northern India. But we don't have a clear story just as to who is the exact owner of the debt. I mean, there's evidence, but it's not systematic enough to link the late 1800s to the early 1900s. But the dominant component is definitely the railways and financing the railways. And then it was completely under-maintained for a 15-year period from the start of the 1900s, and then to refinance and rebuild a lot of railways during the interwar period, especially for transportation of military resources. There's a lot more borrowing on the London markets that the Indian government, the administration in India needs to do. I think that's the dominant part of the foreign asset position.
Can I ask a question about one of the slides you showed, royals and industrialists?
Yes.
Is it possible for you to just get back to that?
Yes.
Yeah, this one. I mean, it's very striking. You know, if you look at the 2016 side of it, you know, how many of them are associated with educational institutions.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether you might be able to say something about the relationship between wealth and an investment in the knowledge industry that one can see much more distinctively in recent decades, as opposed to the, I know you can see some in the former India,
absolutely.
but it's quite striking to see, Hinduja, Shiv
Nadar, Azim Premji, yeah. I mean, all of these have foreign.
Azim
local-
Premji,
absolutely. Yeah, they're all. There's a lot of theories about what capitalists want to do with their wealth and what they pride themselves on, right? So there's theories where you accumulate wealth simply to pay for your future consumption for retirement. But a lot of theories now also say that capitalists save for the prestige of it sometimes too. I mean, they accumulate wealth not just because they want to consume in the future or they want to leave out a bequest to their children, but it's actually a sign of social standing. It's these social effects that are driving their behavior to acquire so much wealth. It makes perfect sense to appear prestigious. I mean, these are all people that you can get publicly on these Forbes type lists, to appear prestigious by making these huge donations and playing
But
a
it's
part.
more than donation. I'm intrigued by the possibility of thinking about education, knowledge, universities as these new assets. You've been talking about assets.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether one can actually link education to, like, land, for example, in terms of the conceptual value that it requires.
I mean, for sure, if you have access to these assets, these physical assets under these educational institutions, you do definitely have assets, but it's not likely to give the same kind of income flows. It doesn't. An educational institution doesn't necessarily generate the kinds of income flows that other assets, which are accumulated for so-called capitalist purposes, would do. It gives you social flows. It gives you social importance. It gives you social legitimacy, and it gives you kind of a place. And from a social perspective, I think it tempers down some of the extremities that your wealth is signifying. Right? So I'm not surprised. I see this less as an investment and more as cultural change since the 1990s in India. They need to legitimize how they've made. I mean, now that they've made their fortune, they should have some legitimate social standing. And I don't want to say that what they're doing is wrong and what they're doing is right, but it does seem to be more social flow rather than an income flow.
So you don't see a shift in the discourse of education or the knowledge industry? In fact, I'm not even calling it education.
Of course. I mean, we know that it's getting so. It's becoming more and more privatized, right? I mean, all these public institutions are undergoing this transformation, while all these new private universities are coming up, and they're all linked to Shiv Nadar and Azim Premji and Ashoka, and they're all financed by all these people. So definitely, there's a market for education. Why send your kids to Barnard College when you can educate them by people trained at Columbia in India? And there's a definite return, and some social standing from that sense. But I'm not. It's not something I've thought about. That's it's something that is part of a cultural and social transformation. Something I haven't really thought about that much. But absolutely. I cannot disagree that there is definitely a trend. You have these royals who don't exactly. Some of them have these MS universities, and Sindhis have some, but they're not exactly the same kind. They're leftover colonial. These guys they've acquired so much wealth that they need to show some social good that they're doing with it. Is how I kind of think about it.
I wondered about foreign wealth and whether you could spell out a little bit more in the now what that consists of. But I also wonder, Indians owning foreign wealth overseas. Tata buys Cora Steel, Land Rover, Jaguar, the Pierre Hotel.
Yes.
Does that count for Indian wealth? What about, a lot of Indians are now acquiring substantial wealth overseas. Where does that fall?
Well, it depends on where their companies are incorporated. For most of the research shows that capitalists tend to incorporate their companies in tax havens, and those are the actual owners. that's where the wealth is actually linked to. That's where the returns will go. That's where companies incorporate. So it could be very likely that Tata owns Jaguar and Coors, but probably his holding company is incorporated in Jersey or Switzerland. But the other stunning thing is that if you look at these people, and if I was to extend this down, very few of them are actually still Indians. The moment they have sufficient mobility, they become foreign citizens. Most of today's inherited capitalists are basically Irish citizens. They're citizens of Ireland. Obviously, so they can do their tax, they pay their taxes maybe in Ireland, which is a bit of a tax haven. I mean, even everyone who's making a lot of wealth in India now is becoming a Canadian citizen or Irish citizen as fast as possible. I mean, Akshay Kumar, the Bollywood actor, is a Canadian citizen at the end of the day, and the Tata, the last CEO of Tata, the son of Palonji, Mistry, Cyrus Mistry, he's an Irish citizen. So it's unclear whether these companies actually incorporate. I don't know if those actually count as Indian wealth at all.
Yeah.
They're probably not. I mean, if you were to include those, well, obviously Indian wealth would look a lot higher. But yeah, they are doing playing a very different kind of game.
I mean, it's an interesting reversal of the idea that you like stay at home, you stay a national, but you make, 19th century model of wealth, you're like a capitalist in the UK, but you have holdings all over the world.
Yeah.
In India, you're a citizen of someplace else, but all of your holdings are in, like, the source of your wealth is in India.
This is exactly what's happened with the person who's recently been caught in this fraud, with the defrauding the banks, this diamond merchant who's living somewhere close by. I mean, he's a few blocks down apparently. He's not a US, he's not an Indian citizen, right? So this company is incorporated somewhere in the Caribbean. That's where the wealth is. If that wealth, I mean, if those assets were brought back, obviously that would count for a lot. But at the end of the day, still the striking thing is the net wealth of even all these guys combined, and these guys are, Forbes magazine takes their wealth as wherever it's incorporated, but it's striking that even despite all this, land is worth 2 years of national income in today's India. So there is a lot of value attached to land. There's almost this intergenerational inelasticity. You move from rural to urban India, but everyone thinks of the safest asset to buy in India is.
But I think it's actually a great story. It's like when an economy is going through a structural transformation, the inelastic thing is urban land.
Yeah.
And so anyone who's sitting on top of that urban land, it's a huge windfall.
Exactly.
And if you imagine that it had no value beforehand, it's just like random who owns it.
Yes.
So a whole new generation of urban landlords is like thrown up by the process of structural change.
Exactly. I mean, this is what's happened in the city of Gurgaon, right? It was a village.
I even think Bangalore.
Bangalore too. Yeah, exactly. Well, in Gurgaon, we know because there's people have actually done these studies linking these families, right? So it's families of farmers who were getting by for a long time, and then suddenly it becomes an industrial park, and that same land, which wasn't exactly producing a lot of output, is now a corporate tower, and that's a lot of wealth, and that wealth appears.
That's also, he's a
Gurgaon part-time resident.
Yeah, I'm a Gurgaon resident. My wife has just written the history of Gurgaon. She talks about some of these things. And but the interesting thing is that many of those farmers who sold off, some of them were clever enough to hold on to valuables farm. And the richest person in Naidu village is someone who kept the land in what is now Cyber City, and is taking rent from the people who built on it.
I mean, the affinity for land in India is, it's a centuries-old phenomenon, right? There's an entire class called Bhumiyars who are landlords by caste. Literally, this is what they do intergenerationally. So, and even in surveys of wealth, I mean, they don't capture the elite, but the average person tends to hold 60% of their assets in the form of real estate of some kind. 50% of it is just pure land. There's very little value of the building attached or anything attached to it. 50, 60, 70%. And even through this transformation, the stunning thing is Indians don't exactly trust the financial markets. They trust the safest, longest standing assets, which are, land, to an extent, gold and silver and precious metals. They're more of a rural phenomenon, but urban Indians are owning land in their portfolios, essentially. So it's this demand for the safest asset in a turbulent, transforming economy.
But how you get the value of that, I mean, I understand how cities are now trying to tax and get this land by this slab method and so forth. But I don't know how you estimate it, and particularly since it's not. There's so many different slum area versus another area. It's not.
I mean, that's definitely a shortcoming of doing this kind of data. It's a challenge to get a number for land, but they have. I mean, the National Sample Survey has a uniform technique, and the only thing we have here is to link up to that uniform technique. It would take a different effort to administratively collect land values, I guess, in India. They're doing it now. They're doing it. They are trying to do it through these blockchain type things, and they're experimenting in small cities. But yeah, that's the only challenge. If I was to add land, I'm certain that if I could get the net value of land in a more realistic representation, I'm certain that would be at least 50 to 100% more of national income, possibly, if it was fully accounted for in everything.
Oh, okay. So there's no more questions. Thanks a lot.